We want to finish our journey through these economies. And the economy that we want to look at today is the one that we're coming out of and going into something else. And that's the service economy. But I want to call your attention again that the craft economy, in terms of where it started in Europe and before it started to change to 1830, that was a very long period of time. And then when I look at 1830, 1840 to 1970, that was a whole lot shorter for mass production. It only lasted that long as the bulk of our economy. When you see the next chart that I'll put up there a little later, you'll see we started through service in the 70s, and we started out of it in somewhere around 2000. That is even shorter. And something else that we discovered is that in the data economy, there are mini economies. There is a healthcare economy. Now, when we think of healthcare, we think about the new National Health Bill and legislation and all of those things. In Massachusetts, you had your own bill that's been going for a couple of years, I think, for better or for worse. But there is an actual economy built around data for health insurance or the medical industry. And so now there's things happening that in my lifetime I've never seen before. And so we want to talk a little bit about that today as we end up. Okay, if not, let's take a look at service. A couple of figures that were very profound for me. In 2010, now realize we went into service in 1970, and I have to define what service means. Service means I'm not producing something. So let me be very careful. In an auto plant, many of the workers that work in an auto plant are service workers. They are not production workers. A production worker or somebody in that other economy, that mass production economy, is somebody who actually physically makes something. So when you think of an auto plant that has 4,000 or 5,000 people in it, you think, well, they're not service workers. Well, maybe the majority of them are. So when we use that definition of service, that's the definition we'll use. In this year of 2010, as I've indicated in my information box, 86% of the payroll jobs in America, non-farm, which there are about 111 million people, are service jobs. If I were a union looking at this as a marketing situation, I would say, what do I look like? God, this is a huge market. Please note, service sector unions have only 7% of that 111 million organized. That is a profound downturn. Now, there are pieces of that picture that are very bright. There are pieces of that picture that are very sour. But I want to put your role, and that is the utility workers union. You are born as a mass production union, but you now have moved into service. Now, when did you move into service, and what am I talking about in terms of service? I'm talking about the biggest place where service workers are unionized is in the public sector. They work for a public organization of some sort. Two profound moves. One was in Michigan in 1965. We had a public worker law passed, a public employment relations law that covers public employees employed by any jurisdiction in the state of Michigan. With that, your union started to organize people in that sector. Pennsylvania is another state, and that was in 1972 when they passed their public sector law. You also, as an international union, moved into that sector to organize workers. What we found is that each time a state or a local jurisdiction had legislation that allowed workers to bargain collectively, that the utility workers looked at those people that they traditionally had, that is in utilities that were publicly owned, and that you made great inroads in those areas, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that you don't employ service workers in the private sector, but a lot of your strength happens to be in those areas where there are public unions. Now, they bring a whole new series of problems, but so as we went into service, you've shifted your emphasis. And why? Because you're meeting the market, okay? The bulk of your workers are still here, but very frankly, you've looked at new markets. Not all unions have. Of the about 80 or 90 international unions at the AFL-CIO, only about 7 of them, and yours is one of them, that have made a move into this area, and that's significant. Go over a page, and I tried to break down the private sector organizing in service. And we looked at utilities. Utilities in service is 26.2% organized. That is phenomenally high for all of the sectors of the economy. So your union and your industry is fairly well organized as it relates to that number. So a good job has been done. Healthcare, and I just want you to notice that healthcare, only 8% are organized. Now let's talk a little bit about that. The majority of those 8% were organized from 1935 to 1965 in states as California, Michigan, Minnesota. Why? Because we had state laws in those cases that governed healthcare workers, what was in interstate commerce then, the definition of it. And all of those people organized before we passed the healthcare amendments in '74. In 1974, the National Labor Relations Act was amended to give healthcare workers nationwide the right to bargain collectively. It didn't add one worker in Michigan. We already had them organized. It didn't add one worker in California. We just fight over them over there. Who's going to get them? What union's going to get them? Didn't add one worker in Minnesota. It didn't add one worker in New York. They were already organized. So the interesting thing is one of the great fears that, and unions ought to be very concerned about it. One of the great arguments that management used is, oh my God, you're opening the doors. Millions of workers will be organized. They haven't been. That should worry us if we're on the union side of the equation. Now, you'll say, are all healthcare workers treated fairly and wonderfully? No, I represented some for a long time in this state. I know how they're treated. And I look at nursing homes and places like that where very frankly, I would expect the union movement to be successful. It really hasn't been. And why? Well, employers, very frankly, nursing homes are not necessarily individually owned. They are also owned by large corporations. And they have consciously made a decision of who they will hire to take care of us when we get old, people. They've consciously hired single moms with children who have have had no mate, been divorced, whatever. Why? Because they can't afford to strike. Because they don't pay them much, they're not required by the states to pay them very much, and very frankly, they're vulnerable. And so you can organize them, but very frankly, to be able to use the normal political pressures we've used in the past to do it, you risk having a single head of household lose a job and with children to feed and what happens. So very carefully, people have analyzed why they can keep a union out. Now, finance, 2.1% of all financial institutions are unionized in the service sector. There is no banks in America. There are 10,000 banks in America. There's not one of them that's unionized. These are credit unions. And why are they credit unions? Because they're credit unions attached to union organizations. General Motors, in our case, in our state, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, if you go to where all our auto plants are, all of the credit unions relate to auto workers.